welcome to the Wrestlers class. We have an exciting speaker for you today, and I'm really honored to have him here, so I'll introduce him in a minute. As we usually do, I'd like to start with a brief word of scripture, and then I'll go on. The passage is Psalm 19, first few verses. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day into day pours forth speech, night into night declares knowledge. There was no speech, nor their words, their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Bit of a paradoxical passage, isn't it? Let's pray. Lord, we do thank you for bringing us together to think about your word, to think about the way that your leaders and teachers have helped us, and we pray that you'll guide us in our thoughts this morning. We pray that you'll help us all to grow in grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. We pray in his name. Amen. Amen. So our speaker today is Reverend Dr. Larry Golemon, who is the Executive Director of the Washington Theological Consortium, which is a consortium of all the religious schools and seminaries in the D.C. area. So it's quite a range of organizations, and Larry will tell you a little bit more about it. Larry Golemon has served the wider church in a variety of capacities. I'll give you a little background on him. He was a youth minister, a local pastor, a college and seminary professor, a missionary, and a researcher. So he's done the gamut. He received a BA in history from Stanford, a Master of Divinity and Master of Sacred Theology from Yale Divinity School, a THM from Columbia Theological Seminary, and a PhD in Contemporary Theological Studies from Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion. He's an ordained Presbyterian minister in the PCUSA. As a researcher, Dr. Golemon was a research associate for a national study of seminary education by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and he co-authored their findings in a book, Educating Clergy, 2006. He coordinated the Interfaith Research Project at Dominican University of California and the Graduate Theological Union, entitled Sacred Visions on the Social Good, which explored religion and public life among Buddhists, Sufis, Native Americans, and faith-based Catholic and Protestant parishes. While at the Alban Institute, he directed the Narrative Leadership Project, which explored story-based transformation of congregational life. He also coordinated the Ecumenical Project at Virginia Theological Seminary, which identifies capacities and new possibilities for ecumenical teaching and learning. He continues to write in theological education with a forthcoming book that tracks how Protestants, Catholics, and Jews have educated clergy for the American culture, specifically as culture builders in religious and public life. So that's quite a resume, isn't it? We have a lot of things to cover, so I think I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to, I've been trying to have Larry come in and speak to us for quite a while. So, Larry, I thank you very much for offering to come and share with the rest of the class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Paul and I've had the joy of getting to know Paul when he was involved with the DOZER program at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Did I get that right, Paul?
Yes.
And his strong commitment to religion and science. He continues to contribute to the religion and science faculty group and study group that we have in the consortium. The consortium focuses on theological schools, just so you know, and we run the gamut of Roman Catholic, historic Roman Catholic schools, Old Mainline Evangelical schools, 2 historic Black Divinity schools, and Richmond and here at Howard, and newer Evangelical schools. And just to give you a range of the theological and, shall we say, diplomatic challenges. We have a new school that just joined us in a satellite capacity in Pittsburgh from the Eastern Christian tradition. It's the Byzantine Catholic Seminary. Cyril and Methodius, who were the great missionaries to that part of the Ukraine and the Carpathian Mountains. And they bring Eastern Christian studies, Eastern Orthodox studies, and other studies to our group. And pretty soon we're going to get, we think, a school in the area here that is very dedicated to the old dispensationalist approach to the Bible. So you can just imagine this range of theological diversity that we work with. We also have partners in Islamic and Jewish and studies and in inter-religious spirituality. But it's an exciting job, never boring, and it has turned me into a bit of from being a bit of a juggernaut to increasingly being a diplomat. So it's been good for me. The long and the short of what Paul read boils down to I have basically followed my very gifted spouse, who is a dedicated theological educator, and so every time we move, I have to figure out something else to do. So that's why it's the diversity of work and range. But when she just went to New Haven, Connecticut to teach at the divinity school there, I decided, I like my job too much, so I'm going to stay here, and we'll do an Amtrak marriage. So either it's the Amtrak romance or the Amtrak decline. We'll see how the Amtrak romance. That sounds like a rather racy novel. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. Today, I would like to, instead of giving a sweep of ecology and theology kinds of approaches, which I thought about doing, since this is a new area for me, we have just dedicated ourselves to a new certificate of studies in ecology and theology in the consortium. And I am trying to get up to speed and to support our faculty members at about 4 of our schools who teach in this area. But please understand that this area ranges from what I would call post-colonial global theologies, which are trying to reassess how the ecological issues and the legacy of both multinational corporations and powers from the north of the globe impact their society in terms of economic justice, the environment in the Amazon, the environment in many developing nations. And it ranges from that to eco-theologies, which really call for a major revision of the Christian tradition that was actually spearheaded by a Presbyterian back in the 1970s. Anybody ever heard of Lynn White? He was a layman, very, very dedicated, very gifted, had a theological education as well. And he's one of those who blames our ecological devastation on the dominion teaching in Genesis. You shall have dominion over the earth. And he called for kind of a radical revision of a lot of Christian teachings. And they're close followers of his still at the Yale Center for Religion and Ecology. Lynn goes a little too far for some of us, so that you also will find what I would call folks who are orthodox revisers or reconstructionists who want to affirm the basic teachings of the Christian faith that we have had for centuries, or centuries, and but trying to understand the basic teachings about creation, about the meaning of the incarnation, the significance of the Trinity, in ways that really empower constructive engagement with our earth as our common home. Hence, we're going to look at today one of the most powerful church documents that has ever come out in this area. Probably the most powerful. And it came from Pope Francis. I tell my Catholic friends, especially the ones who don't like Pope Francis, and there are a number of them in this country, by the way, I say, well, he's my Pope. Why don't you like him? And they know I'm Protestant. And they look at me, and some of them say, well, that's why we don't like him. He's the world's Pope, not, he's not. But, Francis is a remarkable individual in that he theologically is actually not that innovative, quite frankly. Basic doctrines and teachings of the church, he's going to hold the line in most respects. But he, of course, is from Argentina. And he grew up in a developing nation and developing churches, was really experienced the impacts of this issue on the poor, on the nature of the church, whether the church was going to reinforce the economic and the foreign interests that clutched the natural resources of that country, or whether the church was going to be a voice with and for the poor, in challenging those engagements to be more just and show more dignity to human life. He has opted for the latter in his career, and he brings that to the papacy. Now, and Francis also has a style that is very fresh in the papacy, according to my Catholic scholar friends. And we've seen a touch of it in the public media. The media loves this guy, but the style it's very subtle, and we Protestants don't quite understand the intricacies of all of the inner workings of the Vatican and the various power structures of the church that he is negotiating and actually reevaluating. And this document actually reflects that. That's what's so exciting about it. So I'm going to invite us this morning to begin with an overview of this document. Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home. Some people in the back, see, I was trying to urge you not to be Presbyterian and to sit up front by having more books up here. But we do have some extra books, and I'm happy to share them with you. So we will be starting with a little handout that was tucked into the book. It's just a front and back one-page handout called Laudato Si. And Laudato Si actually is a phrase that comes from Francis of Assisi, one of his prayers. And On Care for Our Common Home is the English name of this encyclical. What's the status of an encyclical, by the way, in the Catholic Church? What kind of authority does it have?
Pretty high.
Yeah, that's official teaching of the church. Yeah. Yes, and so it's meant to be a papal voice that is expressing the core doctrine of the church and applying it more broadly to life in terms of the ethics, social engagement, public theology of the church. And this one then is controversial, because it takes on strongly social, political, economic dimensions of this challenge of the care for our common home, the earth. But it also brings in a rich kind of theological and liturgical or worship-oriented background to this issue, which I hope, that's what interests me so much, is this balance between the social and economic analysis and this rich, what I would call mining of the Christian tradition and trying to reclaim it in the strongest form possible. So this would be representative of one of the orthodox reconstructive efforts to claim what the true teaching of the church has been, or the church is, in light of a strong positive ecological engagement. I never started my timer, so I need to do that. Okay, here we go. Paul, we dismiss at 10:30, right?
Yes, there's a
Okay.
clock here.
Very good. The clock won't. You can throw tomatoes. That'll get my attention. Let me just do a brief introduction, and then what I would like to do, the reason you're a little disoriented today with the chairs is that 1, 2, 3, 4, and y'all cheated. I can see that right now. So we'll have to reconfigure you. We're going to ask each of you to mind and look into the text a bit. I want you to work the text a little bit, and I'll structure it in a fairly straightforward way, hopefully. And if you don't have a text with you, try to just look on with your neighbor. We have one more up here, which can be shared if you do need one. By the way, this text, we just used this at a big ecological symposium for theological education, where we had about 20 seminaries throughout the region, beyond our membership, at Catholic University. And the keynote for this is a professor at Catholic University, Monsignor Kevin Irwin, the former dean of the School of Theology. He writes the introduction, the very brief introduction to the papal encyclical. And we were fortunate to have him as a keynote at this event. And Monsignor Irwin knows and was involved with the development of this encyclical in more ways than we are allowed to say. Put it that way. In that, a papal encyclical, of course, has many hands in its development. It's sort of like a Presbyterian committee that puts out declarations for the General Assembly. Magnify that by 100, and you get a sense of it's a composite document. The text itself, though, these are left over from our symposium, so if you would like one, we're glad to make it available to you. And if you can pitch in a few dollars, $5 or something towards to offset the cost a little bit, that would be great. They normally sell for $10, but if you have $4 or $5, happy to let you take it home. And if you don't and you really want it, though, that's fine. But we want to share this as much as we can. Laudato Si is a Catholic encyclical, but it's really addressed to multiple voices and peoples around the earth. It's meant to be a very public encyclical for everyone to consider and engage. And it's unusual from the get-go that it is an invitation to dialogue. It is not an encyclical which insists that this is the right interpretation, especially of the social, political, economic side of this issue. It does reaffirm Catholic teaching around doctrine, so it's not going to hedge on that too much. But it's really an invitation to dialogue with common folk, with people in the international community, with social, political, economic institutions, and of course civil leaders and scientists. So, and it's meant to be a dialogue among all the churches. One gift of Pope Francis is his deep and I would say visionary understanding of Christian churches as bound together in Jesus Christ. So it's an invitation to dialogue, and it demonstrates that in part by immediately appealing to the Green Patriarch. Has anybody ever heard of the Green Patriarch? He's not from Mars. It's Patriarch Bartholomew. Does that ring a bell? Anyone? Patriarch Bartholomew? Yeah. And he is the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is still the name of the church see, located now in Istanbul, of course. He has a compound there, which is about, 3 city blocks? That's the little Vatican of the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's only 3 city blocks. And Patriarch Bartholomew has been the patriarch of Eastern Orthodox churches around the globe for several decades. I don't recall how long, but he has been the Green Patriarch for decades. And here's a quote of his. For human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in climate, by stripping the earth of natural forests, destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's water, its lands, its air, its life. These are sins. To commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. Bartholomew has had a knack for bringing Christian teachings of creation and redemption and the deep liturgical tradition of the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches to speak to the creation issue and the issue of ecology. And we'll see this is reflected in the encyclical of Pope Francis. There are a couple of key terms which are really Eastern Church terms, and all that grow really from sacramental practice in the Eastern Church. Now, how many have been to an Eastern church, like St. Sophia's or St. Nicholas here in town? And of course, those are the churches that are just surrounded by icons, right, in the place of the icons. But if you go into my favorite is St. Nicholas, which is the old Russian Orthodox cathedral, but now that body in America has become the American Orthodox Church, so it has more diversity than just the early immigrant Russians. But you'll see in the iconography not just saints, not just biblical figures, but images from creation. There's even an Inuit image in one of the icons that depicts, I think it's part of their livelihood with fish and some other animals. Because where were the Russians in North America?
Alaska.
Exactly. All the way down to Northern California, by the way. And they want to recognize a kind of indigenous North American presence of their church from the early days. So we will see hints of this Eastern approach to the ecological issue, and he also, there are some other indications here and quotes or references that the Pope draws on. The first page here is indebted to Monsignor Irwin, by the way, in his presentation, and then we'll move more deeply into aspects of the text, which I have tried to mine for us. This encyclical is also unusual in its comprehensive scope. And I mentioned the social, political, economic dimensions. The spirituality dimensions are drawing on St. Francis of Assisi as the key figure in a nature-oriented spirituality, and of course then church teaching and doctrine. There are a lot of aspects of science in here as well, trying to engage the scientific community and as update a possible way that can be done. The predecessors of an encyclical, the encyclical is meant to draw the tradition forward. And you have to kind of understand in the Catholic and the Eastern churches, Eastern Orthodox and others, the place of tradition is very rich and very full and very present. So that the traditions of liturgy and worship, the traditions of church councils and teaching, the traditions of the great theologians, all of these need to be brought forward in an encyclical to speak to today. And we don't have the same sense of tradition in the Presbyterian Church. In fact, Calvin and Luther really knocked tradition in the way it was carried out in the days in which they lived, because it seemed to, at times, take precedent over Scripture. But the Catholics are at least much more, and the Orthodox too, much more careful about this now. and that Scripture and tradition are really meant to mirror and develop one another. So you'll see precedents in here about a lot of dimensions. There are quotes from the two previous popes, Pope Benedict, who was sensitive to creation, believe it or not, and the sense of human ecology from John Paul II. The other interesting sense of traditions in the Catholic Church are also demonstrated in a fresh new style of the papacy. One that we probably haven't seen since maybe Pope Paul VI a bit, the popes around Vatican II, back in the 60s. And it's very collegial, and what the official word for this is, it's conciliar, in that popes that take seriously church councils around the world, and learn from them and quote them, demonstrate a style of the papacy that says the teaching of the church is done all over the earth. And as a pope, I want to learn from and elevate the best of that teaching that I can. And he does it by name. That's what's interesting. You know, every nation, as the Reformed churches organize strictly around peoples or nations. We have general assemblies, you know, of this nation, that nation, this nation. Well, we forget that the Catholic Church has councils of bishops for this nation, that nation, this nation. And the councils, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is one of those conciliar or conference organizations. And they do tremendous work, theologically, ecumenically, interfaith.
Minus women. Women are not quoted or named, are they?
In this, I need to look back and see if any of the mystics were quoted here. The women that are revered are the saints that have been lifted up. You won't find it getting anywhere near the priesthood, right? So there's a real check on it. But you can say that about most of the evangelical world too. So we have to confront that issue on several fronts, which is very real. However, you'll find that there are direct quotes here from 22 different national bishops' conferences around the globe. The Vatican doesn't know what to do with this guy. We didn't come up with this document, they say. We didn't come up with this on our own. They're quoting bishops from around the world. What in the heck is he doing? He's so engaged in conciliar consultation as a model of dialogue within the church, not just in the public, that this document is deeply impacted by that. There's also allusion to World Council of Church documents and teachings and other precedents that have been established by the ecology community, the Paris Accords and other accords as well. So I'd like to jump into the document itself. Any questions first about the kind of orientation of this unique statement? Okay. Very good, yes. This issue primarily in terms of economic viability, that we have the ability to deal with current population growth in most areas of the world, but we're not doing it. So it's a justice issue for him. It's not about controlling birth rates. And that's a very tricky issue in the Catholic Church. But yes, that's clearly for us and for many would be a clear weakness. That and the lack of stronger women's voices. Although in the ecology movements it's cited, it's clear that he's affirming the strong plural nature of those movements: women, men, poor, rich, multi-ethnic, etc. But it's subtle. It's not explicit. Let's jump in then. Current dangers to the crisis, and we're going to do this rather quickly, I think. Find your, under the current challenges, this is more of a refresher for many of us, but I want to demonstrate how the scope here. Climate change is key in this document, but it's not the only key into the current challenge. So take a quick look at the paragraph or two that's listed under those, and find a nugget or two that you want to share with the rest of us real quick, okay? I'm going to give you just a few minutes to do so. From each group, one or two things you found that are interesting, even if there were points of contention for you, and interesting things. Group A.
So on paragraph 21, the salient point, and I'm not speaking for the group, the salient point was that solutions create new problems.
So that was the salient point, huh? Anything else from Group A that you saw?
Paragraph 22, they nicely point out that we have no circular model for use of materials.
Okay. And that means around recycling and reuse, right?
That's correct.
Good. Good. Yeah, that if we could just cycle things that we use more through consistent system on all fronts, that it would be more sustainable. Group B, a couple of things you found.
Okay, first of all, it's a complex problem.
Yes.
And then this particular paragraph laments climate change and blames man without mentioning God's involvement. If you study physics, you will realize that man has very little control of the universe.
Okay, he does allude to other sources of climate change, but he does want to build the onus on us. So it's human, so we say complicity at least, right?
Well, the Pope doesn't agree with that.
Oh yeah, he does.
No, well, read page 64, starts off 101. It would hardly be helpful to describe symptoms without acknowledging the human origins of the ecological crisis.
Right, now I'm saying he's put the onus on us.
Totally, he's what I'm saying. He
Yeah.
blames us for it,
Yeah.
but he forgot Mount Pinatubo.
No, he mentions elsewhere. He mentions volcanoes. He mentions
well,
other
no,
changes
he said
in
right
our
there, the main cause is human.
Well, he does agree with the main causes. Yes, that's correct. But it's not the only cause, but it is the main cause. Group C. One or two things, quickly. We're running the clock here.
Okay. Takes as a given global warming and the devastations that can create in terms of migration and environmental degradation. That takes as a particular issue on water its availability to the poor, and says critically that access to safe drinkable water is a universal human right.
Yes.
That is, I think, the key. It does not go on that I could find in that paragraph to say how that should be mitigated, observed, remedied.
Right. He does mention commodification of water and buying up of water rights that usually serve the rich and urban areas, expensive rural areas, but he hints at what should be solved, not how to solve it. But that's interesting, isn't it? He's saying, I don't know the solution, but this is the problem that I see. Interesting. Okay, so A, B, C, D. What do y'all see?
On biodiversity, it was, you should not think of different species as resources to be exploited while overlooking the fact they have value in themselves.
Good. Very good.
He also, at 34, talks about solutions and problems again. That when you have a diversity issue, you have to fix it with something else, and you have another problem.
Yeah, solutions generate problems, right. But science generates new problems too, doesn't it? Hypothesis, and it needs to be constantly revised. Okay, so DE, what y'all find? A couple of things.
That's the first one, right? Basically, he's saying that humans have a special position and dignity in the environment, and that, as kind of possessing that position in creation, we need to treat one another with dignity and respect. If we expect to be able to treat the environment rightly, we have to treat each other rightly.
This interplay of traditional morality and the ethics of the environment are clearly integral for this book. In other words, how we treat the environment is indicative of how we treat one another in the earth. We may not see it in our own circles, but if you go and visit communities of genuinely poor, desperate people, you'll see it. And of course, in the developing nations, those are often the major populations to deal with. I was a missionary in the Philippines for 3 years, and I can tell you stories about the challenges people face there from the environment alone. The garbage pickers, there's an entire village in north of Manila, one of the largest landfills in the earth. And the children grow up there being taught how to go into the pile and find sellable items or items that they can turn into boots or shoes.
Isn't there just a big fire there recently?
Yes, and the fire and the smoke and the acids and toxins that come from that are a huge health issue. And that's just one little country. It happens in many parts of the world. Okay, let's switch then to changes that need to be made. I'm not saying you have to agree with all this. I just want you to get a strong feel of what's happening in the encyclical. I'm going to run through these because I want us to get to elements of the new paradigm. The primary framework within which the encyclical analyzes the intersection of ecology and social, political, and economic dimensions that are interrelated is called the technocratic paradigm. That's how he names it. And the paradigm, it's a fusion of several influences, some of which come from theologian, I think at least, Johann Baptist Metz from Germany, and Schillebeck's Catholic theologian, and we have several on the Protestant side that were involved in this, what was called political theology back in the 50s and 60s. But it's analysis, basically, both of the structures of thinking that come from the Enlightenment and how those become institutionalized in technological forms and institutions. And he acknowledges the value and the gifts of technology. But he wants to say the way it's now been organized by these structures of thinking is too costly to continue. That it's got to be revised. And just very, very briefly, this is not unusual for a field of studies called critical theory that comes out of a kind of humanist Marxist critique of the Enlightenment. It's not uncommon among several post-modern theorists who want to kind of deconstruct the nature of Enlightenment thought and post-colonial thinking now too. So it's not named by attribute here, but you can see the influences through this. And just very, very simply, and this is way too simple to engage, but we have developed or inherited in the global systems a way of thinking that really elevates the point of the center of knowing and doing in human beings, and we've kind of created a paradigm of what's called the form of reason that is subject-centered. and engages the world around us, and in fact those who aren't like us, as objects to know. And if that's not a dynamic relationship, subject-object relationship is not dynamic and mutually transforming, which it is in some paradigms in the Enlightenment, then we tend to treat all the objects of the world, individual species, terrains, certain geographies, but we also tend to treat people that aren't like us, that we desperately need as objects to manipulate and control and put to our purposes. Especially labor markets would be one way of thinking about that. And the worst paradigm in history, of course, is enslaved labor. We think about how utterly dehumanized slave labor was. But that way of thinking, in terms of knowledge and engagement, has translated into paradigms of technology that basically objectify the earth and objectify laborers that cultivate the resources of the earth to fuel and allow technology to develop. I can't think of the specific example, but there's some pharmaceuticals now that need a very specific chemical agent in order to be produced. And those are produced only in certain parts of the world. The chemical agent comes from a natural resource, and some of you may know this better than I. And some of those natural terrains are being kind of ravaged by the development of this needed agent for pharmaceuticals. The point, though, is this modern paradigm of knowing and of developing technology it's becoming too costly for us now. It served a huge purpose of elevating technology to great benefits for especially people who have assets around the world. But it's reaching a disparity, and you can see it both in the earth, because of the resources we're exploiting, but also in the way human society is organized. You can see who's really benefiting from this increasingly. The northern hemisphere, and increasingly the top 3 or 1%. The 1% now own as much as half of the world's population. Okay, so this paradigm he takes on, he also says it elevates and spreads into really a lifestyle of consumer-oriented economies, where economies depend upon a certain level of consumer economic interchange to survive, and that this has created a world where human beings are really elevated to the pinnacle of the entire earth, and in a way that lends itself to exploiting the earth, a kind of anthropocentrism that is devastating. Okay, friends, we're going to have to pause it there, and y'all can continue this. Well, it won't be. I won't even say that. But if I were preaching, I'd say if the sermon were boring, y'all can whisper in the pews. It's never boring here, from my experience. Real quickly, one point that came up in Group A.
Talk doesn't cook right. Talk doesn't cook right.
Very good. Yeah. We need a concerted action and response to reality. I heard the comment that ideas are great, but reality is even more forceful, is more real. Group B, one thing that came up.
Well, this falls along with the globalist view.
Mm-hmm.
The world population should only be 500 million.
Uh-huh.
They intend to reduce it to that.
Uh-huh.
And it's a process going on today.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. The globalists have done that. I've seen it in writing, but
Right.
David Rockefeller disappeared the other day,
Right.
fortunately. And a
Well,
few others like him are
right.
gone. Things will change.
Great.
See in Washington changing now.
Yeah, it sounds like we have a little Pope's view and a little another view here, but that he does challenge the focus on global population singularly, absolutely. C.
A sense of belonging and needing a community involvement and housing and the transportation.
Yes, and did you notice cultural integrity?
What kind of integrity?
Cultural integrity.
Cultural.
That in order to have community, you kind of have a sense of protecting, honoring, cherishing local cultures. And it's been demonstrated that globalization ravishes many local cultures around the world. And he wants to say, well, gosh, that's a cost too. It's not just the earth, but it's human life. Dee, one quick point?
I guess the one point is the notion that while we're on there, we're stewards for the next generation.
Yes.
And
yes.
not just the next generation, but all succeeding generations.
Yes, he has a long view of humanity, doesn't he? Both directions, not just the past, and the importance to care for and leave a planet that is viable for future generations. Okay, E.
Well, while we have a weakening of the power of nation states, and we have these business transnational, we need international institutions.
Yes. Yes.
To help.
Yes. He wants greater dialogue and building of consensus at all levels. You know, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And he does affirm the international accords. This was time to come out just before the Paris Accord, and that was very, very intentional. There are several other elements of, as a result of trying to reach some more consensus, new approaches to politics, and that we need forms of education that try to really cultivate educational responsibility, educational citizenship, that he calls it. Can you give me one more minute? Okay. I just want to point out, the theology in this document, except for some hints in the beginning, is really at the end. Why? Is it an afterthought?
Presumably informs the rest.
In fact, it's the foundation of the rest. But it didn't start there for a reason. It's not just ecclesial document. It's not just for Catholics. It's not just for Christians. He really wanted to draw a broad conversation of folks and communities into this conversation. And he then lifts up the theological kind of underpinnings of it all. And just to point out, the traditional and continued conservative evangelical readings of dominion as lording over the earth is just plain wrong. And he says that's not church teaching. The incarnation shapes creation. That seems backwards, right? But think about John 1. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. All things were created through him. And that is, of course, the Word that becomes incarnate and joins that creation as part of God's providential wisdom. The earth itself was made as a habitable place for his own Son. Not just for us, but for his Son. And we have to see in that a kind of intention that God has for creation to respect and honor the incarnation itself. Sacramentality of creation is the Eastern influence, really, that just as we would say the Eucharist and the way that bread and wine, the fruits of the earth, are honored and they begin to serve a divine purpose, just as water in baptism is honored and serves a divine purpose, all elements in the world are like that. They're not sacraments, but they have a sacramentality, small s, in that all of the earth can reflect and show the glory of God. It's not just a Catholic idea and an Orthodox idea. Jonathan Edwards, from our tradition, has a little tiny notebook called Images and Shadows of Divine Things. And it's all about natural world, reflecting God's glory. And then finally, just the Trinitarian communion, that the Trinity itself, with the oneness of God, living as three persons, and pouring out into the world the love of those three persons for the entire world is an image for human community. That it points out a kind of mutual love, respect, and honor that we need to recover for one another across the globe and across class and across ethnicity and culture, but also with the earth itself, that we're in a kind of sacred relation and community with the earth. I'm going to read one statement here. Creation cries out in this time of ecological crisis, abuse of nature, and injustice to people place the future in grave jeopardy. Population triples in this century. Biological systems suffer diminished capacity to renew themselves. Finite materials are mined and pumped as if inexhaustible. Peasants are forced into marginal lands and soil erodes. The rich-poor gap grows wider. Wastes and poisons exceed nature's capacity to absorb them, and greenhouse gases pose threat of global warming. That's not from Laudato Si. That's from a General Assembly statement almost 3 decades